Real sports to fantasy leagues, which are showing some very, very real growth. Industry revenues are now estimated to be about $4 billion by the Fantasy Sports Trade Association. Question, though, is how much more it can grow. Here with us now is Chris Russo, CEO of Fantasy Sports Ventures. Before starting his company, Chris was with the NFL, where he launched the league's first ever fantasy football games. Chris, nice to have you here. Everybody loves fantasy football. They like fantasy sports in general, although myself, I would prefer to play fantasy baseball and fantasy hockey. Let's try and answer that question first. How much more can this industry grow? Because the mushrooming, let's say, that we've seen over the past few years, you really wonder whether it can get any larger.
Yeah, well, I think there is a lot of growth left in terms of both the usage and the business of fantasy sports. When you think about not only here in the United States, but around the world, fantasy soccer, the upcoming World Cup, the ability to really take fantasy sports globally, I think there's real upside there. I think also these social networks, the ability to play fantasy sports in Facebook and MySpace also adds a new dimension. So I think there's new areas of growth still left to exploit.
But how popular are fantasy leagues over in places like Europe right now, or in South Africa or Australia, some of these sports-obsessed nations? We know they love their sports, but I don't get the feeling that they've really bought into the fantasy league idea just yet.
Well, certainly soccer, and soccer in the UK and Europe is big in terms of a fantasy sport. I think people are wondering whether cricket in Asia and other sports in South America.
Football.
Absolutely, but certainly soccer is already a strong fantasy sport, and I think there's opportunities for the others as well.
Okay, when we talk about a $4 billion industry, are we talking about the value of the bets placed? Or if not bets, I mean the amount of money that you put into your team?
And not just that. I mean, frankly, what it comes down to is about 30 million players, each spending about $100 to $150 a year on their fantasy sports.
Right.
That's on subscriptions, that's on buying magazines, that's on draft events. So it's really a whole range of things that people spend their money on.
How does your company make money off that?
Well, we are both a subscription-based business and an advertising-based business. So we have about 15 million users a month, and what we largely do is sell marketing programs to big brands like Sprint and Coors and Coca-Cola that want to reach that audience. We also sell subscription services for fans who want extra content, information, and analysis.
Which is the bigger part of your business? Which is the fastest growing?
For our business, it's really advertising, although in this recent slump, all advertising has taken a bit of a hit. But because these audiences are so engaged and so passionate, most fantasy sports have gone to free models in recent years, taking advantage of the growth in online advertising.
Now, where is this? How should I phrase this? The money that the advertisers are spending, the money that the people are spending, what is it that they aren't spending on in order to gravitate towards fantasy sports? Where is your revenue coming out of?
Well, you know, it's interesting because sometimes people view a fantasy player as a couch potato or somebody who doesn't play sports or go to events. Actually, the opposite is true. These are the hyper-engaged users, so I'm not sure they're taking money out of other sports activities. Maybe they're going to the movies less, maybe they're doing other things, but even in the recession, fantasy sports is growing because I think it's a pure passion point that fans want to invest in personally.
Speaking of fans, people have this idea in their heads that the sports-crazed, fantasy-obsessed person is actually a guy. How do you appeal to women out there, or are they already a big part of fantasy leagues?
Well, I think for most pure fantasy leagues, fantasy football, fantasy baseball, there are a lot more men than women playing. But there are casual games like the March Madness bracket-type games, or some mini games that have recently evolved that are easier to play, or introductory games, and there's more of a 50-50 mix.
Have any of your clients asked you to create some kind of a special fantasy game that is intended to appeal more to women?
Well, there have been some experiments around, fantasy Oscars and fantasy entertainment and fantasy paparazzi and things like that. Some of those have succeeded, some of those have succeeded less. But yeah, I think there's a desire to bring both men and women into the fantasy craze, and I think the growth in the women population players is happening.
Okay, Chris, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but a great conversation. Chris Russo, the CEO of Fantasy Sports Venture, thanks for joining us right here.
Thank you.